Hello and welcome to AdTech Heroes podcast. In today's episode, we're going to talk about sustainability in advertising, and I'm delighted to be joined by Harvin Gupta. Harvin is the head of commercial partnerships at Scope3. Previously, Harvin worked at Xandr as senior director of running the solutions engineering team. Hi, Harvin, how's it going?
Yeah, really good. Excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. We're really looking forward to the episode today. Just kind of kickstart, really. Great to understand a little bit more about your career.
Yeah, sure. I haven't really had that many jobs. So I started my career at a publisher called Property Finder, where I was kind of messing around with the ad server and basically running ad ops without a clue what I was doing. But I did learn a lot about the industry. And then my manager left and she moved to a company called Love Film, which is like this startup that was putting DVDs through the post. And she took me with her and she was like, can you build the ad ops department from scratch? So I did that and that was really exciting. Moved a little bit into ad products. And then eventually Amazon bought out Love Film. And it's basically the sort of foundations of Amazon Prime Video. Unfortunately, I got made redundant because they didn't want to run ads. But that turned out to be a great thing because it meant I joined AppNexus as it was then, which in my opinion was a once in a generation opportunity, once in a generation company. It was so exciting to be part of a company that was really defining an industry. So I did 9.5 years there, lots of different roles. I started as a what we called an implementation consultant. So I did quite a lot of consulting with publishers. Then I did a little bit of work on the buy side, moved into solutions engineering, where I worked a lot with brands and agencies, really helping them to understand the benefits of using the Xandr DSP. And then also did a lot of work on the sales side as well. So consulting with publishers about the ad server product we had there. So it was a cool company to work for because I got a really good sense of all the different parts of the industry and how all the pieces fit together.
So it's probably safe to say, like a lot of us in the industry, we've kind of accidentally fallen into this industry, right? Through chance or through just the stars aligning or whatever however you want to position it, right? It's
Yeah.
always interesting to understand how people got into the industry, and it's very rare, especially people that have been in the industry for some time now, that they went to uni, they did a digital marketing course or an advertising course, and went
Yeah.
kind of that traditional route in. So yeah, it's really interesting to hear kind of how you got in as well.
Yeah, so true. I mean, I studied philosophy and politics at university, so not really related. And I remember at my interview for the first job at Property Finder, they said, so tell us about your experience in ad operations. And I was like, I don't even know what that means. I don't know. Like, so which ad service can you use? I was like, I don't know what an ad server is. So I don't know how I managed to get that first job, to be honest. But yeah, you're right. The stars did align.
How have you used kind of anything that you've learned from your degree into your work now? It'd be good to understand if that is the case.
Yeah, I think about that sometimes. I think what philosophy teaches you is the ability to cope with complexity. So, I remember reading some of the texts that you had to study, and it would take me, hours of just reading one page, and you just got to persevere with it. And it's that, I think the one thing I took away from it is the confidence that just because something seems complicated when you first look at it, and it can take a really long time to kind of get to grips with that level of complexity, it's worth doing because, give me the confidence that I can get there in the end. So I think that's what I took away from it. Also, I'm really good at arguing and debating. I think that's, well, at least I like to think I am. And that's another skill I think I got from university. But I mean, you know, is there any direct link between what I learned at uni and the skills and, the stuff I'm doing now? Not really, not at all. If I could go back, I'd love to do, something like philosophy and computer science, but I think it's pretty too late now.
No, never say never. I'm sure you could. I'm
True,
sure you could
true,
fit it
yeah.
in somewhere amongst your daily, weekly life. No, it's. I think it's always good to constantly be, educating yourselves and learning new things. But yeah, I suppose it's about priorities and finding time, right? I think that's what we all
Yeah,
struggle to do in our day to day. But yeah, never say never.
for sure.
Fast forwarding to now, then at Scope 3, it'd be great to understand like a little bit more about what your role is there, and ultimately for our listeners who have never heard of Scope 3, what they do.
Mm. So let me start with the mission because I think Scope3 is a very mission-driven company. It's the first time I've really worked for a company that puts the mission first. So our mission is to decarbonize media and advertising, and we want to get there through data. right? Data is a good place to start because I think everything in this industry starts with data. So what we really want to get to is a point when people are making decisions in this industry, whether that's a publisher deciding what their tech stack looks like, whether that's an advertiser deciding how they're going to spend their budget, and literally everyone in the middle. We want to get to the point that when a business decision is made, carbon is one of the factors that people consider. The environment and the climate and what impact this decision will have on the environment becomes part of the decision making process. I said I worked at Nexus and Zander for nearly 10 years, and I did a lot of consulting. Never once did we talk about carbon. When I was working with publishers and talking about how to design their tech stack from end to end, at no point did we think, well, what impact is this going to have on the environment? And I think that's a problem because the industry and the way it's kind of evolved and what we've ended up with today, frankly, is a disaster for the environment. It really is. And that worries me a lot. It's the amount of energy that we're using, the amount of electricity, and therefore the amount of carbon that goes into digital advertising as it is today. It just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like a fair use of energy, and it doesn't feel like a fair use of carbon emissions. So Scope 3 is about fixing that. It's about trying to drive systemic change in our industry to bring those carbon emissions to as close to zero as possible. And my role as head of commercial partnerships is I mainly focus on the supply side. So I'm spending my days talking to publishers, talking to ad networks, and talking to SSPs. And the conversation I'm having with them is how they can develop green media products. So how they can develop products that are sustainable and will appeal to any advertisers that have made climate commitments. So what we're finding is a lot of advertisers, a lot of the world's largest advertisers have made net zero commitments. So they've said by 2030, we're going to decarbonize our supply chains. So I'm working with publishers to help them partner with advertisers to get there, to help them to decarbonize that media and advertising supply chain.
No, that's a great explanation of what you do and kind of the mission around Scope 3. And there's an article that I read a few days ago. Was some research done by Good Loop, who've obviously in the space
Mm,
and been doing a great
yeah,
job. And it was quite a striking stat, really. So I'll just read it out now. So it was 76% of marketers don't think ad industry is doing enough to tackle the digital advertising carbon footprint. So I kind of like throw that back at you. Do you think that is the case? Obviously, 76% of marketers don't think there's enough has been done. Do you think enough has been done in the industry?
I think there's a long way to go, right? And I think there's not a lot of time to get there. So everyone needs to do literally everything they can. Every lever that we have at our disposal needs to be pulled so that we can start to get this climate crisis under control and get the carbon emissions that our industry contributes to the climate crisis under control. So like I said, I think brands are on the right path. The brands that we're talking to that have made these climate commitments, uh, they're serious about it. They are actually taking these commitments and the promises that they've made very, very seriously. So now what we need to do is change the economics of the industry so that green business becomes good business. And it's possible that these brands can spend their budgets in a way that drives decarbonization. So in answer to your question, I think, it is happening. It's definitely happening. We're having the conversations across the industry. The will is there. I think up until now, there hasn't really been a way to execute on that will. And I think that's where Scope 3 really fits in.
Yeah, I definitely think 2022 was the year where it was becoming a lot more part of the daily conversation, right? And
Yeah.
there were other macroeconomic factors. We've got now, for example, in the UK, the energy crisis, and people really
Mm,
thinking about they should be turning on and off, and not just because of being kind to the world, but actually now because it's hurting their pocket as well, right? So I think
yeah.
that has all made it kind of front of mind. And then within the industry that we're in, like you said, there's a lot of players and there's a lot of conversations that are being had, albeit not so much, on a kind of like face to face level, but with the articles, the press releases, the virtual events that we've had over the last couple of years, it's
Yeah.
becoming more front of mind. And there was another stat I think was within the same research that I looked at, and I think it just for marketers just explains it very nicely of of the kind of impact, because you could keep, myself included, what can I do to help the situation, or how big is this crisis right now? And the stat read, I think, is 1 million video impressions has the same carbon footprint as a flight from Boston to London and back. And that just puts
Mm.
things into perspective, right? All of us on the media end side, with your doing media plans, you're on the agency side and you're working with the client, and you're looking at millions, more than a million video impressions, right? So that just kind of puts things into perspective of how big this crisis is. And I would never have thought that serving or looking at an ad or anything like that is anything near jumping on a flight and going to Boston and back.
I know, I know. So I had exactly the same conversation with Ann Copton, who's one of the founders of Scope3, and she was sort of saying, "Hey, I'm starting a new ad tech business. Do you want to come and work for us?" And my initial reaction was, I don't think ad tech has a sustainability problem. I think print advertising might have a sustainability problem, but digital doesn't. Where's all these emissions coming from? But actually, when you stop to think about how the industry's developed, you stop to think about how much ad tech is involved in the decisioning process, how many data centers are being called to serve an ad, it kind of starts to make sense. Yeah, the other thing I've been thinking about recently is this idea of a cloud. So when we think about cloud computing, the word cloud is a little bit disingenuous because a cloud is this kind of ephemeral, fluffy, like natural thing. But actually, cloud computing, another name for it is server farms. It's just racks and racks and racks of computers that are plugged in, using energy, big data, and loads of air conditioning to keep them cool. So if we stop thinking about, the cloud as being this fluffy thing and just think of it as being a huge amount of computers, crunching away all the time, and all of that energy is going into serving ads, and actually a lot of it's redundant and a lot of it's duplicative and a lot of it's frankly wasteful. So when you start to think of it in that way, it starts to make sense that this industry has such high emissions. But actually, I think that's an opportunity as well. The opportunity is because of the way the industry is developed and the way there's so much redundancy and there's so much waste. It means it's prime for optimization. It means actually there's a lot of scope for us to rapidly bring down the amount of carbon that we generate in this industry because of there's a lot of low hanging fruit. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, definitely. And do you feel now, because we're digitalizing, the carbon emissions are increasing? And the reason I asked that question is because in some other research that I've also looked at, uh, again, to just your point mentioning about print and print advertising, and the print papers we would assume had the most carbon emissions, but actually it's the other way around, right? It's actually the
Yep.
digital, whether it's digital out of home. I think there was a stat about one out of home kind of like display or billboard had enough to power, I think, a couple of, don't quote me exactly on this, but a couple of houses or something over
Yeah.
a few
Yeah.
days. And again, it's just, these stats are just striking, aren't they? Because one would assume, printing on a newspaper and, cutting trees down, etc., that would actually cause more harm. But it's actually the digital side of things that are actually causing more harm.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And that's a revelation. But it's something that, we all have to be a part of the solution. We're arguably responsible for these emissions. We're responsible for how this industry has evolved. A lot of the stuff I did at AppNexus, um, telling publishers to add more and more ad tech onto their page. That's why we're in this kind of mess, and it's our responsibility to first of all measure it, and then try and reduce it and bring those carbon emissions down to as close to zero as possible.
Yeah, and just on your point, you said brands are really pushing for this, and I think the 6 out of 10 brands we're seeing are
Mm,
really thinking about carbon emissions, and now and in the future, with hopefully that will increase to 10 out of 10, right?
yeah.
How much are publishers thinking about this, and what can they do to be more sustainable? It'd be great to understand that.
Yeah, so I would say different publishers are at different levels, of that, different parts of the sustainability journey. I think The Guardian is probably a standout publisher because they've published quite an in-depth sustainability report. And I know Axel Springer, who I work with in Germany, they're doing a lot of work in the sustainability space. So I think they're the leaders. In terms of your second question, what can a publisher do? Well, I think there's a lot of different things. And like I said, we have to pull all of the levers. So there's some basic things, make sure your site is efficient. Make sure there's no pixels that are loading that don't need to be there. Make sure, the heavier your page, the longer it takes to load, the more carbon emissions are going to be. Also, the more, user experience is going to be degraded. So the first thing is think about your site. But actually, the biggest thing a publisher can do to reduce their carbon emissions is to think about the amount of ad tech that they're using and to start to rationalize that ad tech. So, for example, if you're calling SSPs through multiple wrappers, you're pulling the same SSP multiple times for the same auction, that's just doubling up the amount of carbon. Working with loads and loads and loads of SSPs, loads and loads of ad tech, that can also start to add to carbon. So I think thinking about and rationalizing the amount of ad tech on the page is a key thing that publishers can do.
So it's a general tidy up that the publishers need to do. Have a look at what is needed, what isn't needed.
For
And
sure.
would you
Yeah.
say it's safe to say is, we see some of these massive news portals or news publications that are constantly churning out articles every minute of the day.
Yeah.
And what I did read was that actually they're not deleting the old ones. So you've got the old articles that are probably
Mm.
years and years and years old, and that's having an impact, right, on the carbon footprint as well.
Yeah, it's not something I've thought about, but yeah, imagine, all that. But actually, that's what makes the internet great as well. It's the fact that we've got this, this archive of information. I think actually another one that, on the same vein, but thinking through the amount of ads you have on the page. So maybe you can keep up all those historical articles, but think through the number of ads you have. What we're finding is that if you have one high impact, high engagement ad, your carbon emissions are going to be lower than if you have lots and lots and lots of ads. And I think there was a trend a little while ago to add more and more ads to the page, sticky ads, videos that follow you around, all of that kind of stuff. And actually what I'm seeing is a trend in the opposite direction. I'm seeing that quality sites are trying to reduce the amount of ads that they have on the page. That it improves user experience. Yeah, for sure. It actually often improves their advertisers' results, because if you've got one high engagement, high impact ad, that's going to work a lot better than lots of small ads that users don't really see. And the outcome of all of this, the outcome of having fewer ads on the page, is actually there's a lot less carbon emissions. So I think that's a really interesting technique publishers can do, like moving away from lots of ads to moving to fewer ads, but actually more meaningful, more impactful ads.
I think it's a great way to look at it, and is something that us at Seedtag have done over the years. And when we have pitched to publishers, it's saying, look, rather than having 10 ads being served on your page, get rid of that clutter, and serve this one impactful creative that's
Yep.
contextually relevant as well. So, a more contextual ad we've seen is going to lead to higher engagement, higher performance. The user experience is a lot better because it's relevant to the article that they're reading.
Mm.
And sometimes the pushback has been, yeah, but I've got these 10 different ads and they're getting me X amount of revenue. But again, this conversation should be had is what's the at what cost, right? Are you having these 10 different ads? And if you're getting a high CPM for this one or two positions, rather than serving 10 ads in standard placements in the open market, which is probably going to be less revenue anyway, and less clutter. But then in addition now to this, the conversation should be, well, you're being a lot more sustainable as well with your process. So yeah, I think that conversation needs to be had. And when it comes to not just publishers, but ad tech, take a bigger responsibility, right? The SSPs, it comes
Mm.
back down to the value chain and what value is this ad tech vendor or provider providing to the publisher, not only to the brand. So I think
Yep.
we just need to have these kind of adult conversations, right? And to sit around I don't know whether it's a table or a workshop or an event, and hash this out, because yeah, I think publishers ultimately want revenue, and they want
Mm.
to, we want to fund good journalism. We want to, premium content, etc., and the free internet. But we need to think about these things as well. So I think that's definitely important.
Yeah, I really agree with everything you said. I think it was really well said. For me, it's about partnerships. So, you've got advertisers who have made a climate commitment. They need their supply chain to be carbon neutral. They want their supply chain to be as close to zero carbon as possible. And then you've got publishers that need revenue, and and if these decisions are going to impact them from a revenue perspective, I think that's where the opportunity for partnership comes in, and actually looking to advertisers to say, we want to decarbonize with you. We want to help you go on that journey to reach net zero, but we need financial incentives to get there as well. And I think that's a key part of this. So, partnerships between the buy side and the sell side to, flesh this out and understand how is this going to look is super important.
Definitely. And you mentioned you work with publishers all round, and Scope3 work with a range of publishers. It'd be good to understand, does this differ, and the priority for sustainability differ by market or by region? It'd be quite interesting to know. Or is it like a blanket approach across all the
No,
regions
I
that you work
think
across?
it really varies by region. So I would say the UK, we're really advanced compared to a lot of other markets in the conversation. France as well, a lot happening in France. Australia, actually, there's almost been a step change there. So I don't know if you're aware of the politics in Australia, but there was an election where the kind of Greens got in, and there's real movement there towards sustainability. So Australia's coming a long way. I would say a country that's a little bit further behind, but is actually fast catching up is the States. So the States, I'd say, they've got how can I put this? They've got a very busy political agenda. There's a lot going on there. And I think sustainability is a little bit further down the pecking order, potentially a Trump hangover as
I
well.
was going to say it's
Um,
probably because
yeah,
Trump was one of the only leaders to not kind of, work towards a mandate, right?
yeah, for sure. But absolutely seeing states catch up as well. But I think, yeah, it does vary by market for sure.
Perfect. And does it vary by vertical as well? Would you? I would assume, again, with limited knowledge on my side, that it's more the tech space, or the FMCG brands that are really focusing on this. So yeah, does it depend on the vertical?
I think so. I do. I think some verticals and therefore some brands are more advanced than others. But yeah, definitely seeing a lot of interest from, for example, electric vehicle companies. Yeah, they're so aligned with that green message that it makes sense that this will be front and center for them. But yeah, FMCGs, a lot of drinks brands, for sure. But I think what's interesting to think about is, why would a brand want to do this? Like, what is their reasons for making a commitment to be net zero? And what we're seeing is brands are actually under pressure to make those commitments from lots and lots of different areas. It's not just consumers, and consumers are a huge part of this, but actually brands are using their green credentials as a way of recruiting and holding on to staff. A lot of the younger generation, especially they want to work for companies that are green, and they don't want to work for companies that can't demonstrate their green credentials. So I think that's a really interesting point, that it's a way of holding on to staff and recruiting. Also, there's a lot of pressure coming from above. So what we're seeing is a lot of brands, they want to be able to report back to the board and to their shareholders to say, actually, this is the work we're doing in the sustainability space. So, brands on and that's even before regulation kicks in, so brands are really under pressure to make these commitments from across the board. And I think that's why they are. And I think that's why they're taking it seriously.
Definitely. I think another point I wanted to mention is with COVID and the pandemic, it was quite obvious that we rely on a lot of different players for different things, right? And obviously, what's happening now with Russia and Ukraine, supply issues and supply chain issues. With renewables, you're kind of having that self-reliance, right? And hopefully, if it's a local renewables, I think that, and that's what the big push is, right? With each market or country that you're looking at, they're really investing
Mm.
in, you know, using themselves, their resources, rather than relying on other people. Because if anything else, like the pandemic happens again, you're not relying on anyone. And
Yeah.
there was a podcast I listened to, actually, while I was cutting the grass over the weekend, by The Economist, and talking about India as a global power. We know it's one of the biggest markets in the world. It's one of the fastest growing, even now, after the pandemic. And what that's meant is they're saying, well, yep, they're going to be growing at an alarming rate. What that will then mean is
Mm.
they're going to need more fuel, energy, resources. So equally, then what they're doing to combat that, and that increased demand over the next 10, 20 years, they're investing a lot more in renewable sources at home, because they don't want to rely on outward companies outside of their own remit. So I think it's
Yep.
not really a question. It's more of a just a statement, really, is to say, like, these countries are making a big change. They're doing things, but they're doing things locally and investing in renewables, and hopefully we can learn from some of these
Mm.
kind of case studies, maybe in digital advertising as well. So, because we don't want to rely on others for our own success, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So one of the things I was quite surprised when I joined Scope 3 to learn was actually the carbon emissions in the UK vary day by day, and a lot of it is based on the weather. So, on a particularly sunny day or on a particularly windy day, we're going to be having like fewer carbon emissions because we're having a higher percentage of renewables. But then, as you get to winter, people turn on their heating, it switches back to gas. So actually, our data shows that we can see the variability based on what kind of fuel is being used. But I think what you're talking about is a really relevant debate in the UK as well. We're all struggling because of the price of gas, and we're all struggling because of the reliance on Russian energy. And I'm a really firm believer that we should be investing massively in a green economy, and using this as a way of restructuring our economy so that it goes green at the sort of macro level. And that means things like investing in insulation. I think that's a huge part of what we're missing in the UK. It doesn't matter if got all this green energy, if it's just all being wasted because we can't keep the heat in our homes. So I think that needs to be fixed. Onshore and offshore wind, we've got a massive opportunity in the UK to benefit from that. And I don't think we are, but I think there's an opportunity for us to restructure our economy in a green direction that will create energy security. It will solve or help work towards solving the climate crisis, and it'll create jobs. So for me, it's a no-brainer, but I'm not a politician.
Yeah, politician, or we've got many listeners to our podcast that are thinking of their next side hustle or business
Mm.
opportunity. And for me, anyway, if it's in the space of renewables and sustainability and ethics, I think that's here now to stay, and it's now mainstream, not only spoken about. A few people, but I think, like you said, brands are having mandates, governments are having
Yep.
mandates. So if you can get into that space and provide something not only different but better than the other solutions out there, it could be a great space to be in, I think.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think if you think about the green movement, it's kind of changed a bit over the last sort of, in our lifetime. I remember, being a kid and sort of eco warriors and like Swampy and all these kinds of, there was a bit of an association, I guess, between the green movement and like the hippie movement and that type of thing. Whereas now the conversation is exactly like you said. It's about entrepreneurship, it's about investment, and about business being green. So I think that's kind of a shift. And actually, I think it's probably good for the green movement as well to incorporate a much wider group of people and sort of speak to a much larger section of society. So I think that's a really positive shift that we've seen.
Definitely. And then, kind of tying back to our industry, do you think everyone within our industry needs specific training related to sustainability? And if so, are there any programs out there? Is there any kind of resource hubs that we can go into and have a look at?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's key. Like I started at Scope 3 in May, and I've learned so much about sustainability that is crucial. And actually, it's not overly complicated. I think one of the problems is when you start researching sustainability, you can get bogged down quite quickly. But actually, there's a few key facts that I think everyone should know. So in terms of resources, I really want Scope 3 to be a resource. And I love talking to people. I love educating them. I think it's a big part of my role. There's AdNet Zero, and they have a course that people can do specific to advertising. And I'm also working with the IAB as part of a working group there to start to put out things like glossaries and just resources that are specific for the ad tech industry. But if you don't mind, there's two bits of education that I'd like to, or bits of knowledge that I'd like to drop that I think that have really shaped the way that I think. So the first thing I want to talk about is what Scope 3 actually means, not the company name, but the technical term. So I could take a minute to just explain that because I think it's really interesting. So we need to think about how we measure carbon emissions and how we can hold a company responsible for the carbon emissions that they generate. So we have this concept of different scopes. And I'll use McDonald's as an example. So we have McDonald's with Scope 1 emissions, which are their direct emissions. So the way to think about that is imagine McDonald's have a lorry full of, chips and burgers or raw ingredients, and they go to a petrol station and they fill up that lorry with petrol. That's their direct use of carbon, and it's their Scope 1 emissions. And we say McDonald's is responsible for their Scope 1. Scope 2 is in store, where they're buying energy to keep the lights on. They're buying energy to keep the fryers frying and the grills grilling, and their HQ has aircon. So they've got a contract with an energy supplier. So they don't own the power plant. They're not directly burning gas to make energy, but they're buying that in. So that's their Scope 2. And that's quite easy to understand, right? We can think about Scope 1 and Scope 2, direct and indirect emissions, and that's fine. Scope 3 is where it gets really interesting, because actually what we find is often the company's Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions can be about, 10% of their total emissions, and 90% of their emissions is coming from Scope 3. So what Scope 3 means, McDonald's would have to look up and down their supply chain. So who are they partnering with? And they're not only responsible for their own emissions, they're actually responsible for their emissions in their supply chain. So if they've made a net zero commitment, they need to not just bring their emissions to as close to zero as possible. They need to think about the farmer in Brazil that's farming the cattle that gets turned into the burgers. They're actually responsible for that farmer's carbon emissions. And you could even take it a step further. You could say the farmer that grows the grain that the cows then eat as cattle food that then get turned into the burgers. That's the McDonald's supply chain. McDonald's are actually responsible for all of those entities and the carbon emissions. When you start to think of it like that, you start to think that we're all responsible for each other's emissions. We need to look up and down our supply chain and account for all of those emissions. That's when things start to get, in my opinion, get really interesting, because that's how we can drive not just our emissions to zero, but actually the entire industry and the entire supply chain's emissions down to zero. So I thought that was one of the most interesting things that I've learned since I've joined Scope 3 that I wanted to share with people.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it, right? And it's not just the direct impact that we're having, it's also, are we then educating other people and suggesting other ways, of being more sustainable. So I think that's a great way to look at it.
Yep.
So yeah, you mentioned the IAB. I think the IAB has created a standards committee, haven't they, for digital ad emissions? So I think whoever can obviously be part of that, or I'm sure the committee itself will bring different research or have really interesting topics that will then be presented to the wider kind of digital industry. So no, really looking forward to that. I've got just a final question for you. So we always end our podcast episodes with this question. So it'd be great to get your answer on this. So if you had a superpower in AdTech, what would it be?
Cool, good one. Can I have to be able to speak any language, including computer languages as well? So I find, I'm dealing with people around the world, and sometimes language barrier can be a problem. And it's always the other person's had to learn English rather than me learn Spanish or whatever it is, right? So I'd love it if I had the ability to be able to speak any language so I can communicate with anyone. But if we're talking about languages, we might as well extend it to be, computer languages as well. So I could, look at any script in any language and understand it and code in any language. So I think if I could have anything, that's the one I'd pick.
Amazing. It's not an answer we've ever had before on the like 20 plus episodes that we've had. So no, great answer. Okay, great. No, thanks, Harvin, for your time. That's all we've got time in today's episode. Cheers.
That's been really fun. Thanks for inviting me, Dan. Really enjoyed it.